Russia's red carpet for President Xi. Putin welcomes a dear friend, but what can he deliver? After his indictment for war crimes, the visit couldn't come soon enough for the isolated Russian leader. Xi's expected to propose a peace deal with Ukraine, stirring suspicion across the West. The US has warned the world not to be fooled that Putin is even open for negotiation. We'll get the latest from Debbie, also on News at 10 tonight. The PM's optimism dashed by the DUP. It will vote against Rishi Sunak's Brexit deal. How Pakistan is paying the price for climate change. Emily reports from flood-ruined lands as an ultimatum's issued for the world to wake up. Last lap for the First Minister with her party in turmoil. Nicola Sturgeon tells me she'll still be watching from the back benches.
This time next week I'll be heading to the back benches. My mum keeps saying to me, how on earth are you going to cope with that?
Well, what a nightmare for whoever gets the job.
Well, the last thing I want to do is be unhelpful to whoever comes after me.
And late bloomer, why this year's spring will be worth the wait.
This is ITV News at 10 with Julie Etchingham.
Good evening. He has looked an increasingly isolated leader, President Putin, now with an arrest warrant against him for alleged war crimes in Ukraine. So it's easy to see why a rare visit from a supposed dear friend warranted the full red carpet reception in Russia. For his part, President Xi of China has his own reasons to make a bold move on the world stage. In front of the cameras, he wants to paint himself as a global mediator and a promoter of peace. Behind closed doors, quite how far Moscow and Beijing will go in what they call their no-limits friendship is not yet clear. But the sight of both men warmly shaking hands seemed a clear message of Eastern alliance, of Eastern's defiance even, against a common adversary in the West.
From his eager handshake to the smile which hardly left his face, this state visit provides a huge morale boost for President Putin, just days after a warrant was issued for his arrest. President Xi knows he will be seen to support an alleged war criminal, but this is a calculated show of solidarity. Xi Jinping claims to be on a mission for peace, ready to use his leverage with Russia to help broker a deal in Ukraine. President Putin confirmed the two men will discuss Beijing's proposal.
Мы внимательно ознакомились с вашими предложениями по урегулированию острого кризиса на Украине. Конечно, у нас будет возможность обсудить этот вопрос.
Xi didn't raise the topic of peace in this first meeting. He spoke of justice and of economic development.
我们愿意中俄之间的这种战略伙伴关系一方面的话呢，维护国际公平正义一方面呢，促进我们的国家的共同发展。
With a wry laugh, President Putin admitted to being somewhat jealous of China's growth.
Мы даже немножко вам завидуем.
On Sunday, the Russian president made his first visit to the Donbass region, illegally annexed in September. His nighttime tour of occupied Mariupol was staged to highlight efforts to rebuild the city without showing the destruction his bombs had inflicted. Moscow's narrative that NATO expansion triggered the war has been echoed by Beijing, but now it appears the Chinese leader is seeking to prevent a drawn-out conflict. Having recently brokered a diplomatic solution between Iran and Saudi Arabia, China has gained confidence in its global authority. The United States said it welcomed any genuine effort to end the war that would protect Ukrainian territory.
One party to this conflict, Ukraine, has already put forward a just peace formula. If China is committed to supporting an end to the war, based on the principles of the UN Charter, as called for in point 1 of its plan, it can engage with President Zelensky and Ukraine on that basis and use its influence to compel Moscow to pull back its forces.
President Xi still hasn't spoken to President Zelensky. The Ukrainian leader will be watching the pomp and ceremony of this visit very closely. China's credibility as a peacemaker depends on whether Xi Jinping reaches out to the other side in Kyiv.
And Debbie's in Beijing tonight. And Debbie, how realistic that whatever Xi proposes could actually reach any sort of deal, do you think? And what is the broader significance of this meeting?
Well, the peace plan put forward by China calls for a ceasefire and dialogue between the two sides, but it doesn't address Russia's occupation of Ukrainian territory. And it was clear from President Putin's tour of the occupied Donbass on Sunday that he is unlikely to give up his illegally gained ground. President Zelensky has said he will only enter into peace talks if Russia withdraws its troops, including from Crimea, which it seized in 2014. So even if President Xi does make that call to Kyiv in the days following his Moscow visit, the prospect of a peace deal seems doubtful, at least in the short term. But even this attempt at intervention will give China the opportunity to seize the moral high ground. It can raise its 12-point peace plan and say, well, you can't accuse us of not trying. This state visit for President Putin will demonstrate Xi's commitment to Moscow, and it will be played out to a domestic audience as support for his special military operation. For President Xi, this visit is a chance to project his growing global influence and what he describes and he believes is China's growing powerful role on the world stage.
OK, Debbie, thank you. It'll be fascinating to see what emerges tomorrow. Thank you very much indeed for that. Well, here, after more than a year, there had been little doubt that the Northern Ireland Assembly could still be some way off being reconvened. But any hopes of its return in time for the 25th anniversary of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement next month have suffered another setback. The Democratic Unionist Party, who blocked power sharing at Stormont in protest of the post-Brexit Northern Ireland Protocol, say they will not be supporting a key part of its replacement, the Windsor Framework.
For more than a year, Northern Ireland's Assembly has remained firmly shut. And tonight, hopes of an imminent return to power sharing at Stormont have been dashed. 3 weeks ago, Rishi Sunak sold his Windsor Framework as the way to keep Northern Ireland fully British and at the same time in line with EU rules. But not for the first time, the Democratic Unionist Party has said no.
We continue to have real concerns. There are key issues in the Windsor Framework that we believe need to be addressed, that give rise to concerns, not least the continued application of EU law in Northern Ireland, what this means for our businesses and ability to trade within the internal market of the United Kingdom.
On his visit to Belfast last month, Rishi Sunak claimed his deal delivered the best of both worlds.
Northern Ireland is in the unbelievably special position, unique position in the entire world, European continent.
But the DUP say the Stormont break, a mechanism for the Northern Ireland Assembly to block new EU rules being applied there, isn't good enough and they won't return to government. In Belfast this evening, there was frustration. The stalemate continues.
Everybody's been out far too long and certainly the health service here suffer as a consequence of it.
If you could say anything to the DUP and all the parties at the moment in Northern Ireland, what would be your message to them?
Get round the table, start and talk and look after the people of Northern Ireland.
The country's stalling out, everything's getting slowed down and nothing's getting done.
When President Biden hosted St. Patrick's Day celebrations at the White House last week, the DUP and Sinn Féin were both there.
And I've very strongly supported the Windsor Framework.
Next month, the President will visit Dublin and Belfast, but a functioning Stormont looks unlikely to greet him, despite the UK government's enthusiasm for the deal.
It enables trade to continue within the UK internal market. I know the House of Commons is planned to have a vote on it this week. I think it's a good deal, and I hope a majority of members of the House of Commons will support it.
Even with DUP opposition, the vote is almost certain to pass. Rishi Sunak may have held off a Brexit rebellion, but his Windsor Framework hasn't won everyone over yet. Harry Horton, News at 10, Belfast.
Well, adding to the Prime Minister's problems, another thorn in his side, Rishi Sunak's old boss, Boris Johnson, the former Prime Minister, today filed his defence against claims he lied to Parliament over Partygate. He will face questions from the Cross-Party Privileges Committee on Wednesday, as it happens the same day as that Northern Ireland vote. Mr Johnson's dossier of denials is yet to be published, but Robert joins me now. We've had hints, leaks, trails. What do you know of what we might expect?
So it'll be published tomorrow. Let's remind ourselves of, in a sense, the charges against Boris Johnson. And we've got this summary of the Privileges Committee's position, initial position on all of this. And what they lay out is that he attended 5 parties, he was witness to another one, they think, and on multiple occasions he said to the public, to all of us, what the rules were and that we should follow them. So the committee's initial position is that he misled the House of Commons. What he has to prove is that he didn't recklessly mislead the House of Commons. Now, one of the things that his lawyer, we think, is going to say is that the committee is breaking new ground by using this phrase recklessly. I have to say, I think this idea of them sort of setting a precedent is a bit weird, because this whole, frankly, probe is unprecedented. We haven't had a Prime Minister or a Minister allegedly lie to the House of Commons and then be interrogated by a Privileges Committee. So it's not surprising we're on new territory. But the most important thing, I think, that Boris Johnson will say tomorrow is that he relied on advice from civil servants. Now, for example, we know that his Director of Communications at the time, Jack Doyle, said that he was briefing the press that no rules had been broken. And as a result of that, Boris Johnson will say, well, that's what I said to Parliament. But what the committee will say is the country isn't run by middle-ranking civil servants, and you, Mr Johnson, knew what the rules were and you attended parties. So what is it about you that you're incapable of making what most people would regard as common sense judgments? So we're going to get a detailed argument from Mr Johnson. We're then going to see him being interrogated by the Select Committee on Wednesday. But to use a sort of cricketing analogy, I have to say, I think he's on a very sticky wicket.
OK, well, we'll see. It's going to be a busy week all round. Robert, thank you very much indeed for that. Thank you. Now, it may run to more than 3,000 pages, but the warning from the United Nations could hardly be more stark nor more urgent. Its latest climate report says the world is now warmer than at any time in the past 125,000 years and will likely get warmer still over the next decade. Temperatures are already about 1.1 degrees above pre-industrial levels, and it's very likely to breach 1.5 degrees, that internationally agreed target, in the 2030s. Already, more than 3 billion people live in areas highly vulnerable to climate change, and there is, it warns, only a rapidly closing window of opportunity to secure a livable future for all. Emily, our science editor, travelled to Pakistan, where the harsh impact is all too obvious on communities still suffering 6 months on from the floods that devastated the country.
The colour of their clothes belies the darkness in these women's lives. It is a cruel irony they must wade through these putrid floods to collect yet more water, only this stuff won't make them ill. They are the people of Sindh, the southeastern region of Pakistan, not farmers anymore, but victims of climate change. This area is known as Ground Zero. It is also known as Jacobabad. What was once an area of prosperous farmland is now not feeding its people, but its wildlife. Abdul took me to the water's edge to show me where he used to live. The village is still surrounded by water after the worst ever August rains last year.
Their livelihood died during the flood. Their sheep, their cattle, their goats died, all died.
All their livestock?
Yeah, all their livestock, yes.
As they wait for the waters to recede, this is now home. A dusty, hot camp at the mercy of the elements and the traffic.
You sleep here? All your children sleep here?
Khadija's 11th child was born on this verge. She tells me they have nothing, no food, no water. Everything is gone. The floods displaced around 8 million people here. Large parts of the country are still underwater. Scientists found climate change made the most intense rains worse by around 50%.
This is what climate change does. It ruins people's livelihoods. It means whole villages are flooded. It means people have to live in tents along the side of the road, and horrible diseases kill their children. And it's going to happen again, and it will keep happening until more is done.
A temporary medical tent tells you everything you need to know about how these people are living. Mothers queue for hours with their children, made ill by the stagnant waters and diseases that spawn here. Gulshan's brought her 4-year-old son here. He has malaria and a very high fever. She tells me all 7 of her children have been sick since the floods. Hepatitis A, scabies and diarrhoea are all also on the rise. But is it any wonder? With no clean water, they're forced to drink, bathe and wash in what sits around them.
Our animals are drinking this water, and we are also drinking this water.
Are people dying because of it?
Yes, 300 people among the children, women and men were died.
No one knows quite how many have died, preventable deaths since the floods. What we do know is the climate is changing, and there could be many more.
Because we are having a very intense rain for like 1 or 2 days, and then followed by the dry period. But the rainfall is so intense that is the drainage system here is very, very difficult to cope up with that huge amount of water. Climate change is a reality.
Mansoura is living that reality. The wheat and rice fields her family farm are destroyed. She wants to believe life will return to normal at some point, but with the impact of global warming intensifying, what hope is there for those on this land?
And Emily joins me now, and sort of what hope indeed, really, Emily. We should return to the IPCC report. I mean, it's not just a final warning, is it, for developed countries? It's an ultimatum.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Act now, or this will all be irreversible. It is a warning, I think, if you like, before it's too late. Developed nations are being told that the next 10 years are absolutely crucial. It is their last window of opportunity to ensure a sustainable future, I suppose, for us, but I think probably more importantly for our children and our children's children. And the message is blunt. It says in all likelihood we're going to fail in our attempts at keeping rising temperatures below 1.5 degrees Celsius. But even if we do burst through that, it says, that's reversible if developed nations start acting now. And, you know, we have the tools. We know what to do. It's about encouraging them to implement those tools and actually do something. So dramatically cut fossil fuels, invest in renewable energy, make or develop low carbon technology and just be much more energy efficient. Because vulnerable nations like Pakistan, where I went, and there are others, countries in Africa, island nations, they are suffering now. And the report says we owe it to them to be more ambitious because they're going to see more and more devastation. And they are the countries who contribute the least to climate change, but they suffer the most.
OK, Emily, thank you very much indeed for that. Thank you. Now, the woman who's dominated Scottish politics for the last 8 years is on her final lap this week as First Minister, but Nicola Sturgeon could hardly be leaving a party in more turmoil. The SNP is beset with a fraud investigation, a slump in membership and the forced resignation of Ms Sturgeon's own husband as its chief executive just this weekend. And that's before you even consider the toxic battle to succeed her. So when I sat down with Nicola Sturgeon earlier, I asked if she was horrified by what's unfolded since she said she was standing down.
The SNP right now is going through, I suppose, what I would describe as necessary growing pains. It's difficult, but I firmly believe the party will emerge stronger. Parties usually go through a process like this after a catastrophic election defeat. That's not the position the SNP is in. We're undefeated electorally in my entire leadership. We remain the biggest party in Scotland by some distance.
Did you know that party membership numbers had fallen so sharply?
I don't track party membership every day, week or month.
You must have known they'd lost 30,000 in
I didn't know. I didn't particularly know that, but it doesn't. We have declined in membership from a very, very high point post the independence referendum.
So your husband over the breakfast table never said...
We don't... So every year we will download the number from our system for inclusion in our accounts. It's not something that every day somebody is checking what the membership number is. It fluctuates day on day, week on week.
OK, but you're claiming you didn't know that there'd been a drop of 30,000 since 2021. Did your husband mislead your Director of Communications?
Look, he's taken responsibility for what was not an intention to mislead, but
did he mislead, or was it somebody else?
He didn't intend to mislead.
Your husband said in his resignation at the weekend, independence is closer than ever. Fundamentally, if that were true, there is no way you would be leaving.
I think independence is closer than it's ever been, but I think it needs fresh leadership to take us the final stage of the journey. We now are in a position where roughly half the population support independence, and support amongst the younger groups is much, much stronger than that. If I was to sit here and say, would I have loved to have been the leader that took us to independence, and if I was to say no to that, you wouldn't believe me, nobody would believe me. Of course I would have done. But for me, the gaining of independence is much more important than the personality of the leader that takes Scotland there.
You said it's not helpful for any leader or for a new First Minister to have a predecessor breathing down their neck. What are you going to do? You backbenches?
Well, I'm going to the back... This time next week I'll be heading to the back benches. My mum keeps saying to me, how on earth are you going to cope with that?
Well, what a nightmare for whoever gets the job.
Well, I will do everything possible to make sure that's not a nightmare. I'm not going to offer unsolicited advice. I'm not going
even
to
your presence there.
Yeah, I know that, and that's something I'll have to work out, and because the last thing I want to do is be unhelpful to whoever comes after me.
You have given your whole adult life to this so far. Have you worked out who Nicola Sturgeon is without this?
That's part of what I'm looking forward to working out in a much, much more developed way. I've spent all of my adult life so far as Nicola Sturgeon, the politician. And inevitably, when you pursue something, and the way I've pursued politics pretty single-mindedly, the person gets kind of pushed to one side. So part of the reason for stepping down, not the only reason, but part of it is I want to spend the next phase of my life concentrating more on Nicola, the person.
And that moment when you stand up, the last First Minister's questions.
Thursday.
What will that be like?
I don't know. It will be emotional, it will be strange in some ways. But the one thing I've never, in all that mix of emotions over the last few weeks, I've never doubted that this is the right decision. And that's in my core. I know it's the right decision. It's a massive transition for me, for the SNP. I'm not saying it will be plain sailing and easy every day. I may have days where I think, what have I done? But deep down inside, this is the right decision, and I know that beyond any doubt.
First Minister for the last time. Thank you very much indeed, Nicola Sturgeon. Thank you. Nicola Sturgeon speaking to me a little earlier today, and one thing Ms Sturgeon's successor will no longer have to contend with are strikes by NHS nurses and midwives. Industrial action in Scotland has been averted after members of the Royal Colleges voted in favour of a new pay offer. The Scottish Government's deal is equivalent to an average 6.5% rise for the next 12 months. Separate breakthrough on pay at Network Rail has brought to an end one of the year's longest-running industrial disputes. An overwhelming majority of RMT members accepted a deal worth between 9 and 14%. However, it only applies to those working for the organisation responsible for Britain's rail infrastructure. Train operator strikes planned for next week are still set to go ahead. Swiss financial authorities worked to thrash out a $2.5 billion deal last night to rescue Credit Suisse before markets opened this morning. Its struggles predated those of the much smaller Silicon Valley Bank. But when that collapsed last week, investors began looking more closely at the broader financial sector. And amid a crisis of confidence, central banks have had to act fast to try to contain the turmoil.
It was anything but a routine Monday morning for Credit Suisse staff reporting for work at their London office.
Yeah, unfortunately, we've been told we can't talk to the press.
Thanks
anyway. Have a good day.
Their bank rescued, but thousands of their jobs at risk. Emergency talks led the long-troubled bank to be taken over by its Swiss rival UBS, and that, regulators hope, is the end of the drama.
I'm not minimizing, but I'm also saying that we have a strong banking sector, much stronger than it was during the last great financial crisis.
But in America tonight, fears that another bank might be in trouble. Shares in First Republic almost halved in value amid reports it needs to raise more funds.
Crisis of confidence can spiral, and that's the big fear. The question that all investors will be asking is, well, who's going to be next? And until we stop asking who's next, there's going to be question marks over the future.
The tremors began with the collapse of the Silicon Valley Bank, the second largest failure in US banking history. It sent shockwaves through global financial markets. Shares fell sharply, and less than a week later, Credit Suisse got a $54 billion loan from the Swiss Central Bank. But the rot didn't stop, and in a rush to prevent a contagion spreading, UBS stepped in with a $2 billion takeover. Today, 6 central banks, including the Bank of England, began boosting the flow of dollars in the world's financial system. That was the action they took in the Great Crash. From the rescue of Northern Rock to the collapse of Lehman Brothers, a disaster that took months to play out. Much has changed since the calamity of 2008. Banks are supposed to be shock-proof, and our savings are much safer. But whatever happens next, there are already real-world implications for us all. There's less scope to raise interest rates. Good news if you have a mortgage. Bad news in the fight against inflation. There are consequences too for tighter credit.
This could be a real setback, because if banks become more risk adverse and they don't want to lend out to people they perhaps consider a bit more risky and companies that they think carry more risk, that could mean that actually the economy won't have the fuel to grow, because you need to borrow money to invest for the future.
The city, some say, only panics in a crisis. No reason to just now, but nor are we out of danger. John Ray, News at 10.
In France, President Macron's government has narrowly survived a no-confidence vote after forcing through an increase in the pension age to 64. The president was just 9 votes away from being forced to name a new government or call fresh elections. And finally, if you thought the long winter's rather worn on this year, you're not alone. Nature, too, has been feeling the effects of the repeated cold snaps. Blossoms that would normally by now be out in abundance are still yet to bloom. But as if to prove the old adage that good things come to those who wait, experts say we're on the cusp of a countrywide floral wave.
It's the first day of spring, but there's little sign that it's sprung. At RHS Wisley in Surrey, this is the avenue of cherry trees, whose blossom would usually be welcoming visitors by now. Buds still tightly shut. Only a few cherries have started to flower. The season is off to a slow start.
Day length will affect it, but temperature at the moment is the key thing. So we've had a milder winter, but we've had quite a lot of cold spells recently. That holds back the blossom, but now we're getting some warmer days. That's beginning to encourage them to burst, and we're really beginning to see those displays coming into their own.
These delicate blooms are just a hint of what could be to come if the grey and rainy skies are replaced by warm spring sunshine. The end of the long cold spell could lead to a bumper blossom season, rivalling the cherry blossom displays celebrated each year in Japan and bringing some much needed cheer.
Well, spring's long been associated with that kind of renewal and rebirth, and it certainly makes me feel happier than that sort of better, brighter days are to come. And of course, those long, hot days of summer, which seem a bit distant today, are not so far away.
So it may not be long before we see an abundance of cherry blossoms, and that loveliest of trees hung heavy with bloom upon the bough. Martha Fairley, News at 10 at RHS Wisley.
How lovely to think of it. That's all from us for tonight. Busy news day tomorrow, so we will see you then. Good night.